Hello. Okay, this is part two of whatever I was doing before, talking about religion. Yeah, just give me a second. I'll just set this stuff up. So, what I look at today is, well, firstly, this idea that religion is old, and we've had religions long before what they call the five world religions, which is Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. They're probably the biggest five religions in the world today. Um, People have always been religious, and every culture, like it's not just that one culture invented religion, kind of like one culture discovering how to smelt iron or something, and then others discovering it through them, but rather every culture has invented their religion independently, and then discovered, other cultures have religions too. This is an interesting thing that religion already existed in the world at the time when God decided he was going to found Judaism by speaking to Abraham, and saying, I'll make your descendants my people. And so, I mean, you would imagine that if Abraham had never heard of religion before, never heard, then he would be like, well, who is this person talking to me? Is it just a voice from the sky or something? And is um, interesting that religions sort of persist as well. Going back to this idea, or maybe not back, maybe I haven't mentioned it yet, but going to the idea that people believe religions because they're convinced by them, but the thing is that religions have been spread by people who were not necessarily uh, good at talking like me, but not necessarily like me, you know what I mean. Just, parents and societies and whoever, and it's true that children look at people around them to try to figure out, well, how should I behave? But people also question aspects of their society as well. Like, even though you always see people paying for things with money, people talk about, well, what if there's not money? What if money is just a social construct and we don't actually need it, or something like that? So, this idea of religion has been discovered by a lot of people and it's persisted. And when there's been new religions like Judaism or Christianity, people already had a reference point of, well, I know what religion is. So let's talk a bit about some of those kind of features of religions. Sure, a lot of them were polytheistic and stuff, and the gods, maybe they weren't all powerful. Maybe they were limited to particular sectors of power. So you might have a god of farming and another god of war, or something like that. Um, but there was a lot of common ideas. Well, the first fact is that, yeah, there is a god, and all gods, and these beings are more powerful than humans. Well, we don't really kind of clarify whether they exist physically in the present day. It seems like they might have kind of magical powers that allow them to sort of teleport around, because they seem to be able to be in different places. They're not bound by the same rules as humans. There's also beliefs like morality, and a lot of that was tied to religion. And there's a lot of respect for the gods, even if you had a lot of gods in your society and you didn't make offerings to all of them, but just the ones you cared about. But you would still say, oh, well, I have to respect the other gods, and that if you didn't do what the gods wanted, that could be bad, to put it lightly. Did I get turned around? I'm a bit lost. Alright, so that's some of the things. So yeah, like I mentioned, the belief in life after death. Some of them believed in reincarnation, others believe in a sort of a heaven. Uh, the kind of, this idea that you need to respect the will of the gods. The gods couldn't always be understood, but often the gods were wiser than people. So, for example, you think about some Greek stories like Orpheus and Eurydice, and the gods know the way humans are going to behave before humans actually do it, kind of thing. It's a pretty sad story if you ever read that one. So, I don't think personally that old religions are all that different than some of the new ones, even though the new ones basically just combine all the functions into one god or whatever. So we have one all-powerful god instead of gods with different domains of power or whatever. We just have one god who's the god of farming and of war and everything else. We still have the afterlife, we still have morality and all that sort of thing. I'm not very focused at the moment, sorry. Alright, so let's switch tacks for a second. The idea, when people say, well, so I believe religion is true. Well, yes, that's true. And the question is why? What evidence do I have that what I believe in really exists? And one of the things, though, before you ask that question is the question, why did you first come to think about the fact that gods might exist? Because, to give a slightly different example, like when Isaac Newton suggested that there might be gravity, he said, okay, all bodies with mass attract each other. And then he could set up some experiments to prove it, but some people might say, what even got you thinking about whether or not bodies with mass would attract each other in the first place? It sounds like you just made up an idea out of your ass, now you're trying to prove it to us. But he has an original stimulus for thinking that, the famous story, seeing the apple fall out of the tree. But basically, he saw that things fell, and he said, well, things are attracted to the earth, and by my third law, that means the earth is attracted to them. And that's what got him started, but then he had to actually try to prove that this was the case. But at least if he spoke to somebody else about his new idea about gravity, he could say, well, you know how stuff falls, right? And they'd say, right. They'd say, well, I have an explanation. So when we talk about religion, I could give an argument that, like for example, the argument from a first cause. But if you think that I just made up the idea of there being a God, and then after that I tried to look at reality to see if it fit that idea, I mean, I would have had to be pretty lucky that the facts happened to, that the evidence happened to fit the idea I made up in the first place. But if I have a reason for making it up in the first place, well then it's not as surprising when the evidence fits what I believe. Okay, same as Newton says, well, there must be some explanation for why things fall on the ground. And so then, if I come up with a reason and it turns out that I find more evidence fits it, well, then that means that I've probably discovered the thing that explains my initial reason for thinking about this in the first place. That explains why apples fall off the ground when they get detached from trees and so on. So, then, where do we start with religion? Well, in the Catechism it says there are two places we can start, the world and ourselves. And to me, I think that starting from ourselves, from people, is the one that really sheds some light on the situation. We look at the world around us and we say, well, where did it come from? What are the causes and effects? But then some people say that just means that religion is people's way of explaining things that they didn't know before they had science. So it's like, well, I don't know why it rains, so maybe there's a god of rain. But that means if later somebody says, actually, there's a scientific explanation for why it rains, it's because of the sun, then it's, oh, okay, well, then I guess we don't need the god of rain anymore. But it still doesn't explain why people have been religious since the start of history, where we've got the idea from that, you know, we want to know God. You know, and that all different cultures throughout history have independently come up with these ideas that seem to have quite a lot in common. You know, that sure, there's the physical world which we can see, and then there's the rule, in a way, the mind of the world. So the rules of the world, like the laws of physics, that explain how it behaves. But then people said there's sort of like a third thing beyond this. And some of my uni lecturers who were teaching architecture actually, used to talk about the gross, the subtle, and the pure. The gross being the physical world, the subtle being the rules, like the laws of physics, that explain how the physical world works. And then the pure, well, that's sort of being more the spiritual world. But I looked up these terms, and it actually comes from Hinduism. They use a different word for pure. But the pure, the point of the pure is to be the origin of the gross and the subtle. So that, you know, the reason why we have both physical things and laws of physics in the first place is sort of like the birthplace of the things which we already know about, the seed, so to speak. So why was I talking about that? Well, I was saying that it might be that, you know, people come around to the idea of religion just by looking at the world and wondering where does it come from. But it seems like a weird thing to just come up with out of nowhere. Whereas it's, you know, a lot of people these days believe, well, the world is just there. It wasn't created by a person for a reason. It just existed and we happen to be here. So then, but, so we can deny that, you know, we feel the urge to explain why the natural world is the way it is, but how do we explain why we feel inclined to want know to know to even make these things up in the first place? So whenever people make things up, like when you tell a kid to draw a monster, they're going to draw it by putting together parts of things that they've seen before. So they know sharp things are dangerous, they'll put spikes on it. You know, they know animals have teeth, they'll give the monster teeth. Maybe they'll give it scales. I hadn't really seen a lot of scales, so I hadn't seen a lot of scaled animals in the wild, so my scaled monsters looked more like roof tiles. But, you know, we can base it on what other people told us as well, but then where did those people hear about it? It seems like if anything exists in our imagination, it must be that we got the idea to think of it because of something that exists in reality, which suggests that, you know, if we have got this idea of there being a god, well, then where did it come from? Because we didn't see him in the physical world. You know, we don't imagine things that just aren't there, except that they're just changes to things we already know about. If the only things we know about are things that exist through the senses, then how do we come up with the idea of things existing beyond our senses? So that's one of the sort of explanations for why we might think that there is a God, because, well, the explanation is that God has, since if God has created us, then inside of us, he could have put a part of us that makes us want to, that makes us think about the fact that he's out there. Maybe that's not the best way of putting it, but that, you know, we are in some way subconsciously aware of our origin, and that's why we imagine things even though we haven't sensed them in the physical world, because we know about them from the fact that God created us to begin with. I'm going to continue this time. I haven't been going for that long, so let's do another map. Alright. So, then that's not the only way that we come to know God through ourselves, not just because we have the desire for God, although that is one of the arguments that, how do we desire there to be something beyond the natural world if we can't sense that there's something beyond the natural world with our five senses, or however many senses we have. I know there's not just five. Then another question is, why do we have a sense of there being right and wrong? And why do we have a sense that right and wrong is more than just what we need to do to survive or to be liked by others? There's certainly reasons for acting in particular ways, but we have consciences that sort of make us aware of absolute morality. Another question is about our consciousness. So why is it that, I know that if I lost a part of my body it would be weird at first. So if I lost my hand, at first I would think that there's a phantom hand there because I'm so used to having a hand. But eventually I would just get used to it. Well, I'm still me even if I don't have one of my hands. But that's not the same if I lost my mind in a way. So, it's like, well, if you lost your brain's just another body part, right? Why can't you live without a brain? So if the brain is not just a physical organ, it's like when I think of me, sure, my body is me, but I mainly think of the fact that I can think and be self-aware and make decisions. I think of those parts as being me. So I think, when I think about myself, I think there's a part of me that's more than just, based on laws of physics. That's more than just a part of my body. There's a part of me which is my soul, or my consciousness, or my conscience, my free will. There's a part of me that's more than just physical, and I would want to know what happens to it when I die as well. So when I think about the afterlife, the reason why we think about that is because, well, how do you conceive of that part of you disappearing? My physical body, sure, like I said, I could lose my hands and feet and so on, but how can I lose my me? Would I be aware that I was dead if I died? So when animals act, they act to avoid dying, and they act to propagate the species. They don't really have a reason why they do it. So under natural selection, if something helps a species to survive, then it persists, and then we know about it. And if something doesn't help a species to survive, then it doesn't persist. But just because one thing persists, that doesn't necessarily mean we would say that it's good. Like, well, what does it mean for something to be good? Why should we care? So there's going to be some animals, like dinosaurs, for example, they had a lot of good traits that helped their species to survive, but then they weren't able to tell that a meteor was coming and kind of steer it away from Earth, which we might be able to do these days with our technology if there was a similar incident to the meteor that caused the Chicxulub crater. But we know about dinosaurs because they left their fossils behind, but this is just talking about, well, leaving a legacy behind. It's like, but it still doesn't really answer the question, why do animals do one thing and not another? They do the things they do because that's the traits that have been passed on. But if there was an animal that did completely different things and didn't survive, it would still be the things that it did do while it was here. It's just that it's not here anymore. And so there's no particular reason to say it's any better or any worse. It's just that it hasn't left a legacy. Now, why was I talking about that? Um, with humans, um, hmm, sorry, I will try to remember what I was saying. That we have more reasons for what we do than just because we do it by instinct, than just because it's what makes us survive. You know, and the fact that we're intelligent enough to know that there's such a thing as reasons for doing stuff, whereas previous animals, they haven't had reasons. They just do what, in a sense, what they're programmed to do, and they're programmed by their genetics, and their genetics have been developed by whatever helps them survive, whatever persists. But, like I said, animals could do anything. It's just that if they did stuff that wasn't helpful to survival, then they wouldn't pass those things on. It's like with you know, is there, for us though, we say surely there's more to life than just passing on, than just ensuring that the human race survives. We could decide to act in a completely contrary way. I mean, it would be difficult because we'd be going against our genetic programming, but we have the free will to do that. But we also have beliefs about what we ought to do. Where does this come from? So it makes us think that this idea of having reasons for doing things is not just unique to humans, but it's something that's come from God that has created us. What else, like, do we think that we get in the sense that we inherit from God? So I'll explain that. We say sometimes that could a less intelligent thing create a more intelligent thing, or a less powerful thing create a more powerful thing? This idea that, well, if there wasn't a God, then how did we come to be like the way we are? And natural selection explains it in the sense that, well, the world is like our examiner. So really, it's the world forces us to adapt to it. And so the world is the thing that's powerful enough. And that's one of the things I think we realise about climate change, that no matter how smart we are, we're not stronger than the world's ability to, you know, if the world dies, then we die. But that only explains... Let me go slightly off tack. There's an idea in computer science called the singularity, which is if humans could make a machine that was smarter than they were, then the machine could make a computer that's smarter than itself, which could make a computer that's smarter than itself, and so on. That would lead to something of infinite intelligence. And so then we say, well, in the world, if we just come from apes, you know, we're more intelligent than the apes, and then maybe something more intelligent would come from us, but it just hasn't, because there hasn't been enough time for natural selection to weed out our stupidity or whatever. But then I think that humans are actually qualitatively different from animals as well. It's not just that we're not just stronger, smarter apes. We're not actually stronger, you know what I mean? Better at surviving apes than apes were. I'm not even all that sure that we are that good at surviving, considering that we're perfectly capable of creating threats to our own lives, like nuclear war, climate change, AI, superbugs, and so on. So then there's sort of like that question, are humans just a flash in the pan? Um, and if we're not here anymore, is that just the end of the story? You know, is that what's intended for us, just to be here for a short time and then not anymore? And so when we look at ourselves and we say that we feel like we're qualitatively different from animals, we're not just smarter animals, you know, we're also, maybe we might say, more important than animals, in the sense of, you know, some vegans say, oh, you shouldn't kill an animal because it's like killing a person. But most people would say, well, no, killing an animal is less bad, or it's bad in a different way than killing a person. It could be justified in a different way. And so instead of us getting this from something that's lower than us, in the sense of whatever animals that we evolved from have given us a quality that they never had, or else that we've gotten it just from the world because we adapted these things in order to best survive in the world. Rather, I say that we get it from on top, which is that we get it from God, who already has these qualities of, you know, will and intelligence, self-knowledge, things like that, morality, knowledge of right and wrong. I think I had more to say, but I kind of forgot. So instead, I'm going to go on to what are some of the arguments for there being a God that come from the other source, which is from looking at the world around us instead of looking at into ourselves and saying it seems like we have a desire for God and that we have qualities that have come, that we've inherited from God. So we talk about, for example, that the world is cause and effect, and that there must be a first cause, or that the world seems like it was intelligently designed, and therefore there must be a designer.
On this, at least we agree.
No, I'm lost again. Not lost in the game, but lost in my conversation. These, like I say, I think these arguments, though, they're only good at bringing them into play once people already recognize from looking inside themselves that, yeah, there's probably a God, because yeah, yeah. So I'm going to start on the next thing that I wanted to talk about. No, I wanted to say that my timer is going off. I'll just stop the food from roasting while the AI protects me. Oh, that actually looks a little burnt. I didn't really have all the ingredients. I didn't have brown sugar, red wine, garlic, or at least I didn't know where it was. But it should still taste alright. Well, I'll taste it and I'll see. Oh man, what do we do? So the thing is that a lot of people have been religious since the start of time, and the religion is an aspect of our lives. It is normal for us to be religious, and we're not atheists by default unless somebody makes up religion, but rather it seems like we're religious by default unless somebody questions it, or at least unless Um, sorry, still just thinking what I'm saying. That that it's just like if you met a person who didn't know about food, well, that would be weird because they would be dead. If you met a person who didn't know that exercise was good for them, for example, and they just sat around, they would say, but, doesn't your body naturally just want to at least fidget or get up and move around? If you weren't around in a society, would you naturally come up with the idea by yourself that you need to exercise? Just like you would obviously know, although this is biological first-hand information, you would know that you need to eat, but that's just hard-coded into your brain. But I also think that if somebody grew up without the influence of other people, well, they would naturally come up with the idea of there being a God, and they'd want to know about God, even if they didn't use those words, even if their spirituality was very simple compared to ours, well, very different than ours, they would still end up having some things in common with most religions, because they say, well, yeah, this is just a part of life. If somebody doesn't have that part of life, then you would say, well, why not? Yeah, maybe they've explicitly decided to be an atheist after reading about some arguments for atheism or something like that. But obviously, people wouldn't know to call themselves atheists if they weren't religious, because unless they knew that there were people who were religious. But at the same time, I don't think. I guess this is hard to explain. Sorry, I'll sort of move on from this point. I've nearly finished the run anyway. Yeah, it wouldn't be. But then, alright, one last thing I want to talk about while this is finishing up is some of about how it comes to be that religions become complicated. So, when we look at the things that religions have in common, the kind of the core stuff, as in, well, we believe that God is powerful and so on, and we believe that God made us, and we believe that we believe in an afterlife in most cases, things like that. But a lot of people just, I guess, they don't necessarily try to think it through to the end. They have a vague, like I said. And this is what I meant before about the atheists, that people do intrinsically have a vague understanding that there could be more to the world than just the physical world, and that whatever has created us is probably like us in some way. It's probably intelligent and good and has will and so on. What I might do is just I'll leave the game open. That's fine. They should be able to think easier now that I don't have to watch the game. And people don't necessarily ask those sorts of questions about really trying to define God. If it's just a vague idea in their head, obviously they need to develop the religion to a point where they can actually have religious practices and talk with other people about, well, this is my idea of God, what's your idea of God, and invent a religion together that kind of addresses their shared understanding of God. And then the new children who are born in their society then learn about. And again, the children might question it. They might say, well, why is my society telling me that God is like this? Because the children just have a vague idea about God themselves, and the adults seem like they've done the intellectual work to develop the ideas of God. And so that's why, religions can seem quite different to each other, even though they have a lot in common, because of this work, this theology that we've put into it to try to understand it. Theology is a big deal. So then when we start talking about things like, why do people think that God exists outside of time and space, or why do people think that God why do people think that God is all powerful? Why do people think that God is good? Well, these are sort of like, we've started with some basic things that we all have in common that we think about God. And then we've tried to reason about it in a sort of a philosophical way to say that knowing this, what can we conclude about God? So why should it be that God doesn't have a physical body? Well, if he did, then that would mean that something would have had to create him, or he would have to have a place to live before he created the world. And maybe God can just float up in space. I haven't really gone too deep into this, but some people have. And people, by asking these sorts of questions and philosophizing about them, have come up with ideas. They say, well, we think this is true about God. And then they also, if they're part of one of the religions which has divine revelation, where they believe that God has actually interacted with them, then they might see if what they've deduced for themselves also meshes with what's been revealed by God. But that's sort of like, that depends on the fact that you believe that those revelations came from the divine in the first place. So we're back at the question of why do we believe these things about God. And yeah, like not all of the answers are immediately obvious. The idea, if God is the first cause that causes all other things, then can there have been time before God existed? Or when we say, when we had gods who had limited power, sometimes I think in these polytheistic religions, why don't the more powerful gods just fight the less powerful ones, get rid of them, and become the head gods? So we say, if there's a god with limited power, how did they create the universe to begin with? Or how did they, is it possible, for example, if humans worked together, could they actually fight the gods? So in the Greek myths or whatever, they have Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. Now the gods punished him, but they weren't able to take back the gift of fire that he'd brought to the humans. So, that's why some people start saying, well, what if God is all-powerful? So we develop these ideas about God, and we develop them over thousands of years. So it's not necessarily going to be immediately obvious that all of the things that people believe about God can be proven from first principles. Only, as I said, the vague sense that, what we believe about God based on what we believe about ourselves and about the world around us, then clues us into the fact that there might be a God, and then religion takes us from there to say, you already want to know about God. Here's what people before you have figured out or have had divinely revealed to them by God. Anyway, this was a bit longer than the others, but I'll try and address any questions from this one in the next one, as well as talk on some new content. See you then.